They said working at a place like this could change your life. They didn't tell me how. When I first saw the mansion, it didn't look real, not in the way most houses do. It sat on the cliff's edge, grand and motionless, like it had been waiting there for longer than memory. The driveway wound endlessly up the hill, hidden from view until you were already too close to turn back. Even the trees lining the property looked wrong, too tall, too still, as if the wind was afraid to pass through them. The process to get hired was surprisingly easy. A few phone calls, a background check, a thick packet of agreements I didn't really read, just signed where they told me to. No phones allowed on the property, no cameras, no visitors, and of course no questions. I should have known even then that places like this aren't hidden because they're private. They're hidden because they have something to hide. The first time I stepped inside, the house felt wrong. It wasn't the size, though it was massive. It wasn't the design, though it was flawless. Every inch curated, expensive without being gaudy. It was the silence, the kind of silence that didn't settle, didn't ease, but pressed, heavy and deliberate like a hand on your chest. Even when the house was full, music echoing, guests laughing, the silence remained underneath it all, humming just below hearing. The staff was the same, professional, efficient, but quiet in a way that made you feel like speaking above a whisper would crack the walls. They moved like they were part of the house, never lingering, never looking anywhere too long. The house didn't creak. It didn't groan or settle like old buildings do. It breathed. A slow, steady exhale you could feel if you stood still long enough. I learned quickly to follow the unspoken rules. Do your job, stay out of the way, don't look too long at things that didn't seem to want to be seen. It wasn't fear, not exactly, it was caution. The same way you'd move through a dark forest at night, slow, careful, alert. Every hallway was immaculate, every room staged perfectly, as if no one had ever truly lived there. The kind of perfection that doesn't come from pride but from hiding something. And then there were the parties. They weren't loud, not the way you'd expect. They were controlled, music just loud enough to muffle the conversations, lights just dim enough to blur the faces. Famous people floated through the halls, faces I recognized, faces I didn't. None of them looked like they were there to have fun. Not really, more like they were fulfilling an obligation. The parties didn't happen often, but when they did, the air changed, heavier, sharper. Like the house itself was waiting for something. It wasn't the guests who mattered, it was the dates. And it didn't take long to realize. The parties didn't happen when Diddy wanted to celebrate. They happened on certain nights, nights that felt too intentional to be random. No one said it out loud, but the older staff, the ones who had been there longest, moved differently on those nights. Quieter, more careful, eyes lowered, footsteps lighter. I asked once casually, as if it didn't matter if the parties were for a special occasion. The woman setting up the main hall didn't even look at me. She just smiled, small, cold, and said, "Just mark the dates, you'll figure it out." And then she moved on, like the conversation had never happened. It was on one of those marked nights that I first noticed the hallway at the far end of the house. Past the guest suites, past the recording studio. A long, narrow corridor where the lights seemed dimmer, no matter how often the bulbs were changed. At the end stood a door, no handle, no keyhole, no number. Just a door, and whether the house was empty or full, no one ever walked past it. No one even glanced in its direction. There was no sign posted, no explicit rule. But every person who worked there, from the chefs to the security team, obeyed the rule without being told. Don't go near the door. But even when I wasn't looking at it, the door was looking at me. I didn't know it yet, but that door wasn't just closed to keep us out. It was closed to keep something else in. You could always tell when a party was coming, even before the first delivery truck arrived or the staff began whispering about schedules. The house would shift, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, the air growing thicker, the walls tightening as if bracing for something. Preparations were routine by then. Catering, floral arrangements, endless pallets of champagne and wine. Event coordinators moved through the halls in pressed black suits, whispering into headsets with the urgency of those who knew mistakes were not tolerated. On the surface, it looked like what one would expect from a billionaire's home, elegance wrapped in extravagance. But beneath it there was a current, something that hummed just out of sight, and it became clear, the longer I stayed, that these gatherings were not mere celebrations. They were something else entirely. At first glance, the parties were indistinguishable from the usual image of celebrity indulgence. Guests arrived in a parade of polished cars, their faces familiar from magazines and news reports. Laughter spilled from the grand halls, music drifted through the corridors. Yet the atmosphere was different. Guests did not radiate the casual arrogance of fame. They were careful, controlled, too aware of their surroundings. The security measures were equally discreet. No visible guards, no overt weapons, yet the estate was blanketed in quiet surveillance. Entry was tightly managed. Most guests did not offer names, only nods or glances that were somehow enough. It was clear that admission was not a matter of wealth or fame, but of belonging to something unspoken. And then there were the dates. They were not random. It took time for me to notice, longer still to understand. A forgotten clipboard left unattended late one evening revealed a list. No names, no event titles, just dates carefully circled in thick red ink. Curiosity gnawed at me. Later, alone in the dim light of my quarters, I them down and began searching. None corresponded to public holidays, nor to anniversaries one might celebrate publicly. But deeper research uncovered a pattern. These dates aligned disturbingly well with ancient calendars. Nights of forgotten rites, festivals that predated memory, evenings where offerings were made in the old ways, in the old names. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. People can make patterns out of nothing. But it was hard to dismiss once you saw it, and harder still once you started noticing the people who came to the mansion on those nights. They weren't all celebrities. In fact, many of them were not faces you would recognize. They blended into the crowd without drawing attention. They arrived quietly, and more importantly, they left the same way if they left at all. The staff whispered about them, not loudly, not carelessly, just enough that if you were paying attention, you could hear it, fragments of conversations half buried in the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of footsteps. At first, it was easy to dismiss. People left parties all the time, but I began to notice a pattern there too. Some faces never returned. Some cars never reappeared on the driveway. Guests who had entered the mansion with smiles and laughter simply vanished from the landscape of the house, as if they had never been there at all. One night, cleaning up after an event, I found a sheet of paper folded under a silver tray. It wasn't a guest list in the traditional sense, not names but numbers. Beside some of the numbers was a mark, a single red slash, clean and deliberate, where a name might have been. When I asked one of the older staff, a woman who had worked there longer than most, the same woman who once told me to mark the dates, she didn't explain. She only smiled, thin and knowing, and said, "It's better when they're not missed." Then she turned back to her work. The conversation closed. After that, I stopped asking questions, but the understanding sat in my mind like a stone. These weren't parties in any normal sense. They were meetings, ceremonies, performances not for the cameras or the tabloids, but for something older, something hidden beneath the house's layers of wealth and secrecy. Rituals performed in silk and cashmere, with contracts instead of candles, silence instead of hymns. The mansion wasn't merely a place of celebration. It was a vessel, a conduit. And Diddy, he wasn't just the host. He was the high priest of something that didn't need a name, something that had been feeding for far longer than anyone dared admit. The mansion wasn't designed to be understood. It was too large, too layered, like an organism that had grown over time, sprawling and complex, designed not for living but for hiding. For weeks, I kept my distance from the corridor at the far end of the house, the one where the light was always too dim, the air always too still, the one no one spoke of but everyone avoided. But curiosity, like most dangerous things, doesn't strike all at once. It gnaws. It wears you down, and once it finds a crack, it keeps pressing. It was after one of the parties late, when the guests had all gone and the house was silent again. I was finishing up in one of the side halls, stacking linens, when I noticed the corridor was no longer dark. A faint light spilled from underneath the door. I stood there longer than I should have, telling myself to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But the house was silent, and the light, soft, warm, almost inviting, felt impossibly out of place. I don't remember deciding to move. One moment I was standing at the end of the hall, the next I was at the door. Up close, the door looked different, not just plain, ancient. The wood was thick, darkened with age, worn in a way that suggested not just time, but use. There was no knob, no handle, only a small, almost invisible seam running down the center where it could open if you pushed hard enough. I placed my hand flat against the wood. It was warm. The door moved under the pressure, silent, heavy, swinging inward without a sound. Inside, the air was cooler, thicker, carrying with it the faint scent of old stone and something else, something harder to name, like history, but heavier. The room beyond wasn't a room at all. It was a hallway, long, narrow, stretching into the dark. The walls were lined with heavy stone, rough and uneven, as if they hadn't been built so much as carved. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a final, deliberate click. At the end of the hall, a second door waited. This one wasn't made of wood, but of metal, thick, rusted, industrial. A keypad was embedded into the wall beside it, glowing faintly. I should have left then, I knew that. But something in me had already crossed a line. Turning back wouldn't change the fact that I had come this far. The keypad was old, worn smooth from use, but someone at some point had been careless. The numbers 1, 3, 8, and 9 showed the most wear. I tried combinations, cautious at first, then quicker as panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. On the fourth try, the lock clicked. The door opened slowly, heavier than it looked, revealing a space unlike anything else in the mansion. It wasn't a room, it was a warehouse. Rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, filled not with furniture or supplies, but with objects strange, old, mismatched. On one shelf, a stack of faded photographs, faces blurred, eyes scratched out. On another, leather-bound ledgers filled with names, places, numbers that meant nothing and everything at once. A case held rings, watches, jewelry, personal effects, stripped of context, stripped of identity. And at the far end of the warehouse, a second chamber, this space was different. No shelves, no boxes, just a series of altars, small, unadorned slabs of stone, arranged in a wide circle. Each one was stained, not with anything visible, but with a feeling, a heaviness that pressed against the skin, made the air harder to breathe. Symbols were carved into the floor between them, intricate, ancient, worn smooth from years of ritual use. They weren't symbols I recognized, but they spoke of old things, things that predated language, predated history. There was no furniture, no decoration, only the altars, the symbols, and the silence. It wasn't a storage space, it wasn't a room forgotten by time. It was a temple, a hidden place preserved beneath layers of wealth and glamour, carefully shielded from the eyes of those who didn't know to look, or who knew better than to try. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the enormity of it pressing down on me. This wasn't just Diddy's secret. This was the secret of those who moved through the mansion's halls on the marked nights. The secret of the vanished faces, the forgotten names. A place built not for celebration, but for exchange, not for parties, but for power. I don't know how long I stood there before I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow, measured. I turned toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. It never would. It's one thing to find a hidden room in a mansion. It's another to understand why it was hidden. The deeper I moved into the warehouse, the less it felt like a place meant for storage. There was no dust on the shelves, no signs of neglect or disuse. Everything was meticulously preserved, every object placed deliberately, as if part of a larger, invisible design. The items themselves were ordinary at first glance: books, trinkets, photographs, ledgers. But it was the patterns that disturbed me. The photographs, stacked neatly in faded boxes, bore faces that were familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place, Men and women captured at parties, political rallies, boardrooms. Smiling, laughing, celebrating. All of them had one thing in common. Their eyes had been scratched out. Not digitally, not carefully, violently, gouged with something sharp, something personal. The ledgers were worse. Names, places, dates. Amounts listed alongside them in careful handwriting. Numbers that spiraled into amounts that belief. And beneath these surface layers, deeper in the room, the artifacts changed. Gone were the photographs and papers. Now there were objects far older, relics that didn't fit the decor of the modern world. Stone tablets inscribed with characters that twisted the eyes if you looked too long. Carvings so worn they looked almost melted, their shapes indecipherable but carrying the weight of forgotten meanings. Tools, ceremonial, ancient, bound in leather and sinew, resting silently on velvet-covered stands. It didn't feel like a warehouse anymore. It felt like a reliquary. But it was the final chamber that shifted the fear from abstract to real. Beyond a second archway, simple, undecorated, almost forgotten, lay the altars. Not grand, not ornate, just rough stone blocks worn smooth by time and use. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each aligned with precision that spoke of a deeper order, an older understanding. Between the altars, the floor was carved with symbols, not letters, not anything as simple as language. They were shapes, twisted into spirals and sharp angles, interlocking in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. I recognized nothing, and yet, some part of me understood enough to know I wasn't meant to. These weren't decorations, they weren't relics, they were tools. Components of something vast and quiet and meticulously maintained. The air inside the chamber was different. It was heavier, thicker, not just with dust or time, but with the pressure of things unseen. Standing there, I could almost hear it, a vibration too low for sound, a hum deep enough to feel in the bones. It was the silence between heartbeats, the stillness before a scream. I thought about the parties, the careful guest lists, the faces that came and went without record. The dates marked not by celebration, but by expectation. This wasn't about money or fame or status. It was about power, the oldest kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't ask for permission. A kind of power that demanded tribute, not in blood, not in violence, but in something deeper. It wasn't a place where things were kept. It was a place where things were offered. The house was the stage, the parties were the performance, but this was the altar. And the offerings weren't objects, they were people. Standing there, breathing the heavy air, feeling the silent weight of centuries pressing against the skin, I understood something more terrifying than anything I had seen or heard so far. This was Diddy's secret. It wasn't his at all. He was a caretaker, a tenant, the house, the room, the altars. They belonged to something older, something that didn't leave, didn't sleep, didn't forget. And every party, every night of laughter and music and disappearing guests, they weren't accidents. They were obligations. I don't know how long I stood there before the feeling shifted, the air growing colder, sharper. I wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere behind me, slow, measured footsteps echoed on the stone floor, not rushed, not hesitant. Certain, I turned, but the chamber behind me was empty. Still, the footsteps continued. Closer, slower. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. There are moments when fear gives way to something colder, something heavier. Standing there, surrounded by the silent artifacts and the heavy air of that hidden chamber, I realized I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In houses like this, secrets aren't simply kept, they are guarded. They are fed. I backed away from the center of the room, moving slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might provoke something unseen. The stone beneath my feet was worn smooth by years of use, the patterns carved into it whispering of rituals too old and too deliberate to be dismissed as superstition. I hadn't just stumbled onto a hidden room. I had walked into the heart of something designed to remain invisible. When he appeared in the doorway, it wasn't with the dramatic flair one might expect from a man known for commanding attention. There was no anger in Diddy's posture, no surprise. He simply stood there, watching, his face a study in perfect stillness. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence in the room wasn't empty, it was full, heavy, a silence that carried weight. Finally, he moved forward, not quickly, not cautiously, just at a steady, deliberate pace. He didn't look at the objects around us. He didn't need to. It was clear he knew every inch of this place, every item cataloged and remembered. "You're not supposed to see this," he said. His voice was low, even without emotion. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a simple fact presented without drama. He took another step into the room, his footsteps absorbed by the thick stone floor. There was no point in denying what had happened, no excuse to offer. Instead, I stood still, waiting for whatever would come next. When he spoke again, his words were unexpected. "I was like you once." He wasn't looking at me. His eyes traced the circle of altars, the faded symbols on the ground. He spoke the way people do when they are remembering something they wish they could forget. He told me how he had once believed he was in control, that all his success, his fame, his empire had been built on his own decisions. He thought he was the architect of his destiny. "But this place," he said, glancing around the chamber with a tight, almost imperceptible grimace, "it doesn't belong to anyone. It's older than the names we give it, older than the stories we tell ourselves to sleep at night. We're just caretakers." He paused near one of the altars, running his fingers lightly across its surface, not reverently, but resignedly. There was no ritual in the gesture. It was a touch born of familiarity, of understanding that some debts never stop being collected. "They don't tell you that part," he continued. "They let you think you're building something permanent, legacy, power, influence. They let you think it's yours, but it's not. It never was." I wanted to ask what it was, what entity or system demanded such a price, but the words caught in my throat. He seemed to understand the question anyway. "It's a bargain," he said, "one you make without even realizing. You get what you want, success, access, immunity, but it takes from you, not all at once. Little pieces at a time, pieces of yourself, pieces of others." The room seemed to grow colder as he spoke, the weight of his words pressing down harder than the thick air. "And if you try to walk away," His voice trailed off briefly before returning, harder now, edged with something like regret. It doesn't come for you. It comes for the ones you love, the ones who trust you, the ones who never agreed to the terms but pay them anyway. He stepped back from the altar and faced me directly for the first time. His expression wasn't one of threat, but of warning, an exhausted man trying to explain to someone younger, someone more foolish, why they should leave the fire alone. That's why the parties happen. Why do the names disappear? It's not about celebration, it's about obligation, payment, regular and quiet. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Finally, he spoke once more, softer now. You have two choices. You can pretend you never saw this and hope it forgets you, or you can run and hope you're faster than it is, but you won't be. He turned then, without waiting for a response, and disappeared back into the shadows of the corridor from which he came. I stood there alone, the only sound the faint humming silence that filled the room like a living thing. It was in that silence I realized the truth. Some prisons don't have bars or locks or guards. Some prisons are built out of promises and kept standing by fear. Some are as old as memory itself. And once you're inside, there is no easy way out. Leaving wasn't a decision I made all at once. It wasn't even a decision at all, more like a slow realization, a surrender to the understanding that no one ever really walks away from a place like this. Not by choice, not with their life intact. After what I saw in the hidden chamber and the conversation that followed, something shifted inside me. The house felt different. The air is heavier. The silences longer. People no longer looked me in the eye the way they used to. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Tasks were reassigned. My hours were cut. Small changes, each insignificant on their own, but together they formed a clear message. I had seen too much, and now I was being erased. There are two ways things end for people who overstep in places like this. You either disappear, quietly, efficiently, or you disappear yourself. I chose the latter. It started with small mistakes, forgetfulness, confusion, the signs of stress that are easily noticed but rarely questioned. I dropped glasses, forgot instructions, showed up to shifts looking disheveled and distracted. I made sure the right people noticed. Not too much, not too fast, just enough to plant the idea that I was unstable, unreliable. The house responded the way it was designed to. Meetings were held, whispers circulated. I heard the older staff muttering under their breath, words like liability and risk. It didn't take long before a quiet suggestion was made. Perhaps I should take some time off, for my health, for my future. I agreed, nodding and smiling with the dull, vacant expression they expected. I accepted the offer of a car to take me away. A severance envelope quietly slipped into my hand. No ceremony, no scene. Just a quiet exit as if I had never been there at all. But leaving the property was only the first part. The real challenge was convincing the system, the one far larger and older than Diddy or the mansion, that I no longer mattered, that I wasn't a threat, that I had no stories to tell, no secrets to leak. I moved cities. I changed phone numbers. I left no forwarding address. More importantly, I retreated from ambition. No memoirs, no interviews, no anonymous. I took jobs that paid in cash and didn't ask questions. I lived in small apartments where the neighbors didn't care if you vanished one day without a goodbye. I faded quietly, deliberately, piece by piece, but erasure has its costs. In the months that followed, the world around me began to fray. Memories blurred at the edges. Friends stopped calling, not out of anger or neglect, but as if they too had forgotten I ever existed. Sometimes, walking down a crowded street, I would catch my reflection in a storefront window, just for a moment, and swear the face looking back wasn't entirely my own. At night, in the quiet hours when the world slows and the mind wanders, I would feel it. Not fear, not regret, something else. A weight just behind the eyes, just beneath the skin. A reminder that some rooms once seen mark you in ways you can't erase. I haven't spoken to anyone since I left. I doubt they would remember me even if I did. The mansion continues on, parties ebbing and flowing with the seasons, names rising and falling in the public consciousness, sacrifices made quietly in exchange for things too valuable to name. Diddy remains a fixture in a world that worships success but never asks at what cost it comes. He smiles for the cameras, collects accolades, builds empires. But if you look closely, if you know what to look for, you can see it. The weight, the silence behind the eyes. Some debts are never paid in full, and those who serve the house, whether willingly or not, carry the cost forever. Time dulls most memories, faces blur, events fade. Even the sharpest pains lose their edge eventually, worn down by the slow erosion of everyday life. But some things I've learned don't fade. They settle deeper. They change shape, become part of you. Years have passed since I left the mansion, since I made the quiet choice to erase myself before someone else could do it for me. On the surface, life has moved on. New names dominate the headlines. New faces smile from the covers of magazines. The parties continue, different guests, different eras, but the same silent rituals disguised under newer, shinier veneers. The house still stands. I hear its name whispered sometimes, buried in conversations among people who think they understand power. They talk about fame, about success, about money. They don't talk about what it costs. They don't know what it takes to hold on to things that were never truly theirs to begin with. Sometimes when the world quiets late at night or in the early morning hours before the sun rises, I feel it. A faint pull, a weight beneath the skin. A memory that isn't quite a memory, a presence that is quite mine. It hums at the edge of consciousness, low and steady, the way it did behind that sealed door. You don't truly leave a place like that. Not really. You walk away, but part of you stays behind. Part of you keeps paying the debt long after you've stopped counting the cost. I don't tell this story to warn you. Warnings don't work. Curiosity is stronger than fear, stronger than reason. It's the oldest hunger we have. But if you've listened this far, if you've heard even a whisper of what I've tried to tell you, then maybe you understand something most people never will. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't march through the front door. It waits behind walls, behind locked rooms, behind the smiling faces of those who seem untouchable. and it always demands more than you think you're giving. If this story made you think, even for a moment, then leave something behind. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand that not all doors should be opened. And if you're not ready to look away, if you want to know what's hidden beneath the surface, subscribe.